Señores y señoras,
Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to our third day of the International Neogranadino Symposium of Operational Design, Geopolitics and Strategic Thinking, Challenges and Opportunities for Colombia and Otan allies. We are right now meeting here in the Neogranadino University Lecture Hall, and we want to welcome today to all the attendees here in presence, especially the body of generals and admirals and who are here today, all the officers and NCOs of our national police, military forces, and of course to all the directorates, the deans from law faculty, international affairs, Robinson Ramirez and Cedeño. Thank you very much for being here. Greetings on behalf of my General Luis Fernando Puentes Torre, Dean of the University, General Deputy Director General Baca, and General Major Gustavo Adolfo Campo, Director of the Geostratégicos in Political Affairs, IEGAP. Today the panel is going to be very interesting. The panel today is going to be about something that we all are wondering a lot in this academic field. And the name is NATO, Geopolitical Context, United States, Israel and Colombia Triangle, Civil Relationships and Military Diplomacy. So it's a set of very interesting topics. And I want to read, of course, also to everyone who is now attending via streaming the YouTube Military University channel, and also we are being seen right now from other countries such as Canada, Israel, United Kingdom. Thank you very much. I want to remember you that the event was possible thanks to the partnership between the Military University and Archipelago of Design, AOD, one of the most influential think tanks from the Western Hemisphere. And today we're very pleased to have one of the important experts, Ofra. Welcome back again. And they are connected right now via internet. Greetings also to the presidents and co-founders, Philippe Dufault and Philippe Dubuc, and all the teams from the Military University who supported us to have this event. And saying that, now I want to introduce to you the moderator of this important event, Dr. and Colonel Professional of the Reserve, Fernando Barrera Chavez. My Colonel Barrero, welcome to your university. He is someone very close to the armed forces, and we care him in this environment, military environment. My Colonel Barrero currently is the Director of Culture Public Relationships of CAFAM, Compensation Family. This is a big company dedicated for the benefit. He was also ambassador to Colombia in Madrid, and also in different general assemblies from the UN. As we said before, professional officer of the reserve, Colonel Director of the Command of Professionals, Officials of the Reserve, President of the Circle of Journalists in Bogotá, Professor at different universities in Colombia, and the Academic Accreditation Council in 30 times. Before giving the floor to my Colonel Barrero, I want to remember you that we're going to have today two segments. The first one will be from 8 to 10 And 9:45, we will have a short break, drink some coffee, go to the bathroom, and Dr. Ofra and Dr. Marcos Peckel will be with us from Canada. And after 10 a.m., we're going to have here in this panel 3 people in person, and we hope to end by noon. After each lecture, we will have a Q&A session and then a professional discussion with all the panel members. My Colonel Barrero. So the floor is yours. Can you please continue with the panel of the day? Thank you very much. My Colonel Rojas, thank you very much. And thank you to all the attendees here in presence or face-to-face or virtually. Dr. Ofra, it's a pleasure to me to receive you here, also appear in reserves. So now we're going to present Dr. Peckel, Director of the Jewish Community in Colombia, Professor in the Diplomatic in the Colombia, Professor at Rosario and External Universities in Colombia, columnist, analysts about international topics, mainly the Middle East, and different means and organisms in Colombia and abroad. A master's degree in engineering, University McGill, Montreal, Canada, pre-grade in electronic engineering, and his expertise is in the international affairs and Middle East. The lecture of Dr. Peckel is the political triangle, Colombia, Israel, and the United States. Dr. Peckel, thank you very much for attending and to be virtually connected. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Are you hearing me? Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Colonel Barrero, Colonel Pedro Rojas, thank you for the invitation. Greetings to my panel peer, Ofra Graicer. I had the pleasure to meet her some days ago. And greetings from Canada today. Now we are exactly in Toronto. This is fall, winter is coming, and you know that here in Canada, winter is very strong. And I am very pleased to share with you greetings to everyone who is here in the venue and all those who are connected using the different platforms. My lecture today, the title was designed by myself. I designed the strategic triangle, Israel, Colombia, United States, because it is not an established partnership. There is no alliance like Quad, for example, between the United States, Australia, and Japan, or the recent announced outposts between Great Britain, United States, and Australia. And even more, the oldest of all of them, the Five Eyes, including our members, Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Great Britain. So it is more about a triangle-type alliance that emerges from a lot of different common interests and values. And we cannot forget the value of values, and it's redundant when we are talking about geopolitics. Really, those are states with many topics in common. Cooperation, and also how to embed to the world. The 3 are democracies of long-lasting democracies. United States democracy was since the founding 1776, and Israel since the state was created 1948, and Colombia 200 years of the Republican life. Always has been a democracy, including the period during the General Rojas Pinilla, where there was an agreement of the parties. So General Rojas were ruled. So we are talking about states where democracy is part of their DNA. States that the democratic vision includes or fights or confronted every type of enemies. Terrorism is a common enemy for the three countries. The United States has suffered it. Obviously, Israel almost in the state foundation, and also Colombia since intermittent but almost continuous during the last half century. Fighting against terrorism has been an essential part of the strategic geopolitical vision of the three states. And also we can find that at the level of trade, the three countries have an open economy of trade, free commerce, and it's not by casualty that Colombia has a free trade agreement with Israel and with the United States. Israel has a free trade agreement with the United States, and that's where we have that triangle at the commercial level. Talking about the military cooperation, and I'm going to be talking about in detail about all this, but our main enemy is the International. In terrorism are the different communicating vessels, whether it's Al-Qaeda or terrorist groups in the Middle East, Hezbollah, Islamic State. The links proven from FARC with other international terrorist Middle East organizations, and therefore that fight against terrorism, where these countries, we don't have good or bad terrorism. The three countries have joined in an important manner to fight against it. And also, there is a strong cooperation in other topics that we cannot discuss right now. Our military topics are very important in the strategic topic. And we are talking about technological cooperation, cultural cooperation. Cultural exchange among the three countries is very broad and extensive. In the educational plane, many students from Colombia are receiving grants or scholarships to go to the United States or Israel. We receive students from those countries here in our country. Therefore, we are understanding that this cooperation and in the land of the operational intelligence, strategical intelligence, operational intelligence is very close since many years. This is an alliance that's not an alliance. No one has signed any accord. I don't remember that the three presidents of the three countries have met in a meeting to something as we recently saw in different cases. But, however, it's clear that we have this alliance. From the Colombian standpoint, Colombia is the main ally of the United States in Latin America, and also friend and ally of Israel in Latin America. Not always has been that way. There have been some changes through time, but we know that today we can see it that way. And we don't have any doubt that Colombia, as one of the points of the edges of the triangle, and the relationship with Israel and the United States is very close. Let's talk now about the three relationships to see where they're joined. Obviously, the relationship between the United States and Israel is one that not always was as important as it is now. Maybe it was after the 6 Days War, 1967, when the relationship is more close. The first days of Israel, as in the years of Israel as independence, when they were fighting for independence, the first day of Israel after the Declaration of Independence, May 14, 1948, the first war started. And since then, the country has confronted complex wars terrorism, that war and the weapon support to the Jewish state come from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union supported strongly at the beginning Israel, also United Nations for the state creation, but also the Soviet Union military support that in that moment Israel needed it because they were going through a war, and another one in 1956, another one in 1967, another one in 1973, conventional wars against states. And that was from France. France, when Israel fights the 6 Days War, that war that changed completely the regional geopolitics, and that small state with a lot of strategic vulnerabilities and geographic vulnerabilities, and winning the armies of 3 states, much of that weapon was coming from France. After the 6 Days War is when, in the middle of the Cold War, is more close the relationship between Israel and United States, and it was more narrow. It not always was one without any problems, issues, or discussions, debates, or confrontations. And sometimes even it was hard, but little by little, that relationship started to grow and get stronger in 1973 when Israel is attacked by the armies from Syria and Egypt. By surprise, the day of forgiveness. In that moment, that war lasted almost 3 weeks, and Israel received the unconditional support from the United States, an air bridge from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was sending weapons to Syria and Egypt, and the United States was sending them to Israel. And even when there is a large conflict, and since then, that's a very important relationship when Israel received the first military support from the United States that turned even more important, signing the peace accord between Israel and Egypt in 1978, after the visit in 1977 of the President Sadat, President of Egypt. And it's not by casualty that the sign of that accord, Camp David, the first minister of Israel, and one from Egypt, meet in the White House under Carter's administration. And it's then when, as part of the accords, Israel starts receiving an important military support per year of $3 billion from the United States. And Egypt is receiving a similar help also since then. But it's very interesting also that when we analyze the aspect of the peace accord that wasn't approved by the safety country to deploy the peace forces in Sinai, with the pressure of the Arabic countries that were against that. And since then, there's been an important change to the accord signed by Egypt unilaterally with Israel. And the multinational of observers is created, and their new blue helmet is one founded by the United States, and the country who was going to be there was Colombia. Colombia with the Battalion Colombia 3. And then we see how also after the Sinai War in 1956, when this Lester Pearson creates these blue helmets, and they're deployed for the first time to Sinai to divide the forces from Egypt and Israel. And Colombia is part of the first component, Colombia Battalion 2, and will be there in the Sinai. And we see Colombia, the blue helmet, were there from the United States. Israel-United States relationship, as I am saying right now, get stronger and stronger until, without getting in all the detail, we don't have enough time. In 2014, Israel and the United States signed a strategic partnership accord that replaced a former one signed in 2012. The cooperation between Israel and the United States at all level, intelligence, maneuver, joint maneuvers. We saw one in Israel with 8 countries from the NATO, and that's something really strong, important, and as I am saying, is based on interest, but also based on democratic values, civil society values against terrorism always. So that's the first part of the triangle. Israel, United States, very well done. Israel, they have some diplomatic support to the United States in the UN, mainly in the Safety Council and also in the General Assembly and in other multilateral entities. Let's now talk about Colombia, United States edge. In Latin America, for the United States, the strongest partner is Colombia, and that's historical. And nevertheless, different interpretations of the history, we can go back to the sign of Urrutia-Thompson Accord, 1916, when Colombia signed Urrutia-Thompson after losing Panama. Once Colombia loses Panama in 1903, there were 2 options in foreign policy. One, to get mad with the United States, who was the one to took us away Panama, if Panama was ours. In theory, it was ours, was part of Colombia in the maps, and then comes the final separation of Panama from Colombia, and United States was an important part of that. And finally, the real world, to understand that the strongest one was the United States, the global power was the United States, and it was much better to be a partner and friend of the United States and to get with this soup saying, okay, you took us away Panama, but we also want to be your friend. That Colombia received a check of $25 million. That was a fortune back then. And Marco Fidel Suarez, president, says, Respisim Polum, looking to the north. And since then, we have been their partners. But maybe half-century after is when one of the most important facts and transcendental ones in the foreign policy of Colombia, and that was the participation in Korea's War 1950. When the United Nations established that finally, after different banded by the Soviet Union, and they reject the invasion by North Korea and establishes the force of the United Nations with United States as the head and Colombia, the only country from Latin America that decided to be part of that war. And as I said before, mainly one of the most transcendental decisions of the Colombian foreign policy. It was Laureano Gomez, the president, who promoted that idea when most had no idea where Korea was and that there was a war and why we needed to go so far. But Colombia sent the Colombia Battalion 1, Almirante Padilla Frigate. We lost many men in Korea, many disappeared, and since then there is a military strategic partnership between Colombia and the United States that has lasted until today and beyond any declaration from the academia and the politicians that this is a relationship that is going through a crisis. President Blinken was some days ago in Colombia, and he said the relationship Colombia-United States is the most important one that United States has in Latin America. But after Korea War, other episodes come. that were very important and were useful to strengthen even more the relationship between Colombia and the United States. And we are talking about the Colombian posture to go to Malvines no matter what was the cost, and the collaboration, as I mentioned before, in the Observers Multinational Force requested by the United States. Uruguay was also there, but we continue there. And the posture of Colombia at the OAS supporting the United States. The support given by Colombia to our war, if it was or good, bad, it's a fact that Álvaro Uribe Vélez supported as only country from Latin America the operation of the United States in Iraq. And we are talking about a relationship that has strengthening internal conflict in Colombia was essential in that relationship. And then comes Plan Colombia. Plan Colombia is by means received $10 billion aid from the United States to fight against drug trafficking, to fight against the armed insurgency, criminal actors, and also social programs. That's a plan that the other countries many countries haven't received, and it was very important to take Colombia away from the situation that was going through by the 90s. Everyone was qualifying a failed country, a failed state, and we were able to recover our security, the investment, to recover the name of the country during Álvaro Uribe and Juan Manuel Santos' ruling. And also the Plan Colombia ends, and now comes Paz Colombia. Different governments of Colombia have expressed the close partnership with the United States, included clearly the government of the President Ivan Duque Marquez, the military collaboration, the collaboration in technology, free trade agreement, and the diplomatic support, the cultural exchanges between both countries are a clear demonstration of what's a strategic relationship between Colombia and the United States, and it continues being. And when the multilateral organisms like UNASUR were created, aiming to take status in the United States from the Latin American integration. And that integration in Latin America has never existed, really. Colombia was a strange body there in UNASUR. What's a strange body always? CELAC also, because we cannot understand that there is an entity created only to take our main partner away, and we are active part of it, so that's weird. Now let me talk about Colombia and Israel. That relationship is one that has strengthened during the last years. Maybe during Virgilio Barco ruling, before they didn't vote it, but they recognized Israel and voted to accept to the UN Israel in 1949, and then there is established some diplomatic relationship and exchange of ambassadors in 1950 during the last century. And Colombia develops the relationship with Israel, although in the diplomatic field, Colombia was supporting Israel, wasn't against Israel either. But Colombia goes to organizations like the non-allies, and that time has a weight in the diplomatic support. However, Colombia always kept a friendly relationship with Israel until that relationship get closer with Virgilio Barco government. And that will have an important boost during the government of Andrés Pastrana, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, Juan Manuel Santos, and Iván Duque. And why that relationship? First of all, the cooperation in security, the military cooperation, intelligence cooperation was very important to Colombia. we were confronting every type of actors, armed insurgency, non-state actors, different armed groups, and then paramilitaries, obviously drug trafficking and criminal gangs. And to any country, the foreign policies reflects the internal situation, and something that has marked the foreign policy in Colombia is the internal situation of a permanent conflict against different armed groups. As I just mentioned, Israel for us was very important. And as I said, also the values. The values are key for a geopolitical relationship. And in 1970, Israel turned into the country with more grants were given to Colombia to go there to study. And they are leader, and now it's part of their diplomatic arsenal, the advances of Israel in terms of agriculture, dropping, sparkling, public transportation. Everything has been interested to develop diplomatic relationships, and also they have done it with Colombia too. During Virgilio Barco government is when Colombia acquired the first aircraft carrier that we still have them. Years after, Israel will acquire the license to manufacture Galil fuselage that are still being manufactured by Indomil. Some are being sold to Israel, but not focused just in the military part of that relationship, although it is very essential, but there are other aspects that I want to mention too. During the years of the government of Uribe and before the war against the cartels, Israel cooperation in intelligence, telecommunications equipment, military equipment, that has really been very, very important. And also it has been transcendental for the development of the relationship between both countries. During the Plan Colombia period and the war that started by the beginning of this century against the cartels, Israel's support was also very important. And it's not by casualty that the first visit from a first minister of Israel to Latin America in the history of Israel that was 2017 by Benjamin Netanyahu, and he included Colombia and also Argentina and Mexico. And to Colombia come the Israel Minister of Defense, and maybe the second visit of a Minister of Israel to Latin America was to Colombia in 2011. And in 2013, we have the state visit of the President Santos to Israel, and we are close to receive the visit of President Duque to Israel soon, so we can see how strong is that relationship, and that relationship has different edges in this cooperation. In 2020 Colombia, President Ivan Duque declared Hezbollah, Hamas, and other organizations as terrorist organizations, in the same plane as the United States and Israel fighting against the transnational terrorism. That's not minor. It's a decision that's very important that also has practical implications from the standpoint of trying to find some funding sources, people that will be engaged on these activities against the Colombian state. Free trade agreement signed by Israel with Colombia in 2013, and the visit of President Santos to start this agreement, and that was a tortuous path through the Congress of the Republic and our Constitutional Court. Finally, the accord was started August 2020, and that opens important opportunities for the technological exchange. And then the Office of Technological Exchange and Innovation that soon will be opened by Colombia in Israel, announced by the President Ivan Duque, that will be in Jerusalem, shows also how strong this relationship is. And to conclude, on what I call this geopolitical triangle, So we have three countries joined by a lot of common interests, similar values, democracy defense values, free economy, free trade, against organized terrorism, against organized crime, even against those states that are supporting terrorism and support also the inherence against democratic states. And we can mention Iran, Venezuela, and Duque reinforced that he has no interest on reestablishing the relationship. So that shows a conceptual clarity, defending the democracy as mainly one of the most important elements that are joining these three countries, Israel, Colombia, United States, in a cooperation, and in many cases unknown, many cases is known. And I've tried to bring here to you, dear friends and attendees, in this lecture. So I'm running out of time right now, therefore I am going to close right now, and then I'm going to give a space to Q&A. So I am here to respond any question. Fernando Barrero, Colonel, thank you. Colonel Rojas, thank you. And my panel peer, Ofra, thanks for being here. So I will be here attending your questions. Thank you, Dr. Peckel. I have a question before giving the floor to Dr. Graicer. What's the main challenge of this implicit partnership between Israel, Colombia, United States? A government of left in Colombia will limit the military, technical, economical, and social cooperation between the three countries? Colonel, thank you. The challenge before answering the second part is the same. Okay, yeah, we are against states that support the instability in Israel. They need to fight against Iran, not just a state, but the proxies in the borders located in Syria, Gaza, Lebanon, Iraq also. And that makes that Israel is confronting a state beyond non-state actors, a state supporting those non-state actors that are trying to destroy the Jewish state. Colombia also has gone through similar challenges when we see that Venezuela will not to say it, I will not to have it that way, when Venezuela is the refuge of the terrorist criminal organizations against the country's security and democracy. And the United States also has confronted the same enemies. I think that's the main enemy for the three countries. About a country of the left here in Colombia. First of all, I don't want to speculate before the elections. I don't know what would be the decisions the government will make in that moment. Yes, there will be some limitations because a government, we need to see how left is that government. In Latin America, Lula, for example, in Brazil, the same, the governments in Chile and also in Uruguay, where there was a left country, even, or Rafael Correa also strengthened the relationships between technological. I cannot speculate, really. I don't know what will be the posture of the governments when the relation with Israel of mutual interest. If one government will turn into just one of ideology, trying to establish a failed state that has failed in many other places, and they continue insisting. That's why Venezuela has no relationship with Israel since 2009, and that has been very bad for Venezuela because they lost an important country that could have helped them with during the pandemic and all the lacks that they have. We can see if the left government will continue the paradigms, the pragmatic paradigms, or the left state is going to be just one of ideologies? We don't know yet, Coronel, and thank you for your question.
Le solicito.
I ask you to please remain with us to listen to Dr. and then have a final reflection for this panel. It's a pleasure to introduce you. I have a special admiration for your country. I had the pleasure of getting to know it, of seeing how a nation can bloom amidst the desert, viewing your technological and economic developments. I was fascinated by my visit, and I'm pleased to present you as an expert on systemic operational design, strategic thinking, and leadership. You've worked, Dr. Graicer, in the last 2 decades with the military and with defense establishments around the world to transform them into self-disruptive systems. Dr. co-instructs the General's Course of the Defense Forces of Israel together with Brigadier General, I didn't get his name, preparing higher officers for their work in designing the strategy and operations for the new era. Your research, Dr. Graicer, include deep operations, special operations, cyber operations, developing future concepts, projections, war games. And I will apologize for my English. Your book, 2 Steps Ahead, From Deep Ops to Special Ops, Wingate the General, has been circulating in the main schools of warfare since 12 years ago. She also served as a sniper official at the FDI and was educated on arts and film, political sciences, and security studies. You can visit her website by visiting www.ofragraicer.com. Her presentation, Israel and Colombia Perspective as Global NATO Partners, will be enriching our session today. I was very pleased to see your picture on Monday as a reserve officer on the field, and I was reflected in you as an officer of the glorious Colombian Army. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Gracias. Hello, hola. Today I'm going to share with you, I've been sharing with you my thoughts all over the week. For those of you who've been here since Monday, I am speaking from, reminding that I'm speaking from an Israeli perspective, I'm speaking from a military perspective, and I'm speaking from what we call systemic or strategic operational design perspective, which is in our approach what generals need to do. And in our approach, what generals need to do is first and foremost ask questions rather than give answers when the world around us is changing. So first of all, thank you, Marcus, for opening the panel as you did. You saved me a lot of time and took some notes into my presentation. And I'm going to speak about Israel and Colombia and their entrance into a partnership with NATO. And again, I'm just going to offer some points for discussion. I think the 2 countries are facing similar challenges in their interaction with NATO. And that's because these 2 countries or these 2 militaries, armed forces, share similar advantages. And the countries also share some problematic relations with the West and with Western institutions. So this is what I'm going to focus on. When I was making the presentation, I didn't even realize that the Israeli defense forces are already conducting exercises and some operational missions. The photo on the right, you see it's Israeli Navy patrolling the Red Sea with an Italian helicopter. And then on the left, obviously, that you've seen a lot. The Colombian armed forces have been operating and training with NATO and NATO allies for many, many years now. So my first question or insight has to do with NATO, an institution, an organization, which is suffering from some malaise that I've spoken about yesterday. Mostly two of them. One is weakness, some weakness of these international institutions in the last couple of years, and that mainly has to do with the fact that they are based on Western ideals of former of World War II, Western law and order, shared values, as Marcus kept reminding us, which is true, and also one empire, which is the United States, willing naively or ideally take the position of the police officer of the world. Now, the U.S. is not the only, obviously, global empire, but we shouldn't be mistaken. China only has one ambition when it looks at the global, at all the countries in the world, which is to take everything, extract all the economic and infrastructure potential that is there, and doing so by Chinese means, but it has no aspirations of governing the world, policing the world, establishing law and order. On the contrary, where it doesn't exist, China fares better like it does in Africa. And Russia, and I'm talking about Russia 2021, I'm not talking about the USSR. Obviously, the Soviet Union did want to spread communism and had some ideals behind this expansionism. But Russia, Putin's Russia, is also looking at the world and looking at conflict areas, and again, just trying to extract potential, mostly economic potential, but have no aspirations of leading the world from the perspective of law, order, Western ideals, and so on. So I just put your, again, I'm looking from a military perspective on NATO. And I've put not only NATO, but I've put obviously NATO, the European Union, the United Nations, the G7, and the OSCE, which is security cooperation in Europe. And why have I put all these institutions? Because I'm looking at these institutions and I wonder, what is the intent, what is the capability, and what is the impact of these institutions? And I'm talking about 2021. And it is a good question, at least in my mind. Economically, obviously, the G7, and maybe not just economically, the G7, in my mind, is the most strong of these institutions if I'm looking at intent, capability, and impact. The EU, it's a good question. The United Nations, we have a lot to say about the United Nations. I've spoken before with Daniel before the panel on the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. The World Health Organization is getting a lot of money right now, but really it doesn't have any operational capabilities or any tools that it can have to actually uphold the spread of pandemics. So diplomacy, yes. Cooperation, yes. Maybe help in some peaceful conflict resolutions, but is any of these organizations really capable of providing the security and defense that these coalitions are talking about, and actually not just talk about it, not just palabras, but actually do something about it? And I'll give some examples. Another thing I'll say about these institutions is that all of them suffer from the same tension, which is being based on Western ideals, as I said, but keeping an open, transparent door to any other partner that wants to become a member or engage in a dialogue with these institutions. So if we're talking about NATO, and this is our focus in this panel, NATO has an open door policy towards Russia and China and North Korea, but these are NATO's greatest military rivals. So what do you do with all these ideas when these partners or frenemies or these rivals, and you do have to exchange with them when it comes for issues like pandemic and climate change. But how do you engage with them when you don't share the same set of ideals and same set of global interests? And this is a weakness that is going to affect also the interests of Israel and Colombia into NATO. Another thing that I want to say when I'm looking at these institutions, more or less of them, I think the G7 is the most balanced of them all, because each member of this G7, which is a voluntary arrangement, comes with its economic might, and economic might can be measured, unlike ethical might, and even military might, because military might always goes hand to hand with legitimacy. I don't need to explain it if I'm sitting here in Colombia and talking from an Israeli perspective. So if you don't have legitimacy, your military might is not enough. So if I'm saying that the G7 is more or less balanced in the, again, intent, capability, and impact of its partners, definitely in NATO, we have this hierarchy. We have members, we have partners, we have dialogues, regional dialogues. Israel is a part of the Mediterranean dialogue. And NATO also have individual agreements, like the one it has with Russia or the one it has with China. And they are not the same. The impact is not the same, the intent is not the same, and the capabilities or the cooperation or the value that each partner brings into this coalition is not the same. And this is also something that I think that Israel and Colombia need to think about in their relationships with NATO. Next question. Does NATO, as an organization and a coalition of many, many countries, have a set of unified political strategic interests? Or is it about trying to come into some median average between the interests of each individual state? Obviously, if I talked about hierarchy, then the interests of the bigger states are going to trump the interests of the smaller states. And when I say smaller states, and this is something that if some of you here are studying international relations, the issue of, there are these new buzzwords, global power competition, and whether small states have a strategy or they don't. Small states, it's not necessarily about the number of people or the size of the country. It has to do with intent, capability, and impact. So Canada, for example, and I've been working with the Canadian Armed Forces in the last couple of years, Canada considers itself, maybe they wouldn't say a small state because it's not a small state, a medium-sized player. And by medium-sized player, they say that they don't have or they don't need a strategy because their strategy will always be the strategy of the bigger player in the coalition. So it will be the strategy of the US, or it will be the strategy or the policy of the United Nations, or it would be the strategy and policy of NATO, and so and so. What does it mean? That they are putting the interests of the coalition or the interests of the bigger player on top of their own interests, because they always go second. So this is something to think about. I think both Israel and Colombia have, as states, as independent states, have political interests, strategic interests that not necessarily align with those of NATO. So what does it mean when we go into this partnership when these interests are in conflict? From the point of view of Israel, we see it in the last decade, the whole issue of Iran developing nuclear capabilities. So it is depending on the changing of politics in each country and the changing of politics in the international institutions. But sometimes Israel sees eye to eye, at least with the US and or sometimes also with the EU or some partners, maybe France or the United Kingdom, as to how to stop, how to prevent Iran from developing military nuclear capabilities. But now with the new administration in the US, they're back into diplomatic talks. So Israel's interests do not align with the interest of these international institutions. So this tension is being managed all the time, and I'm sure I'm not an expert on Colombia, maybe one day I will be, but I'm sure Colombia has its place where its interests don't match those of NATO. So here I put an example of, and I'm calling obviously from poker, the house always wins. And in that case, in the house, I don't know if it's NATO in total or again, the big players, the ones that are up in hierarchy in the pyramid of NATO members. In 2008, I had the privilege of doing some work in Georgia. In Georgia, the country, not Georgia, the USA. At the time, obviously the USSR dissolved, fell apart in 1989, and especially the countries who were in the belt between the old Russia and Europe were attempting to become westernized, looking west to Europe, trying to become democratized and gaining, promoting liberal values and so on. So Georgia was one of them. The president at the time, Mikhail Saakashvili, he was in his 40s, a very intelligent man, an academic with public administration experience. And he had a vision for Georgia, which is a Western Georgia, yes? I'll use the Hebrew pronunciation. He had big plans for Georgia. And he brought back to his administration many youth that went to study in good universities in the West, in Europe, in the US, and practically begged them to come and build with him a new Georgia. And part of the building of this, for example, the Minister of Defense, I spoke about it with Conan Rojas the other day, he was 27 years old. But he was this wizard, this wizard kid with a lot of capabilities, given huge responsibility at the age of 27. He was the Minister of Defense and other people like him. And part of this attempt to go west was to try to join NATO. And in order to join NATO, like Colombia knows and like Israel knows, you had to pay for it. So you started training according to NATO standards. And you had some military aid in order to build your force, because the Georgian forces were remnants from the Soviet forces. And basically it looked like Boy Scouts. They had no infrastructure. They had no food. They didn't have uniforms. They didn't have equipment. They didn't have ammunition. And they took their best. Let's say they had one brigade that was a functioning brigade, and one battalion that was more than a functioning battalion, and they took their best assets and they sent them to aid in NATO missions. They were, I think, the second in contribution of non-NATO members to the mission in Afghanistan for many, many years. And they were waiting for NATO to make a decision. In 2000, they weren't the only, also Poland was trying to do that in other countries. And in 2008, when they were really turning against the Russian bear and looking towards NATO, NATO decided that it's not taking this decision yet. It's postponing the decision. And we all know what happened. We can see it in the slide. We all know what happened. Russia understood things very quickly. It invaded Georgia. It took over Abkhazia. This operation devastated whatever was left of the Georgian armed forces, and the world did nothing about it. The same happened to Estonia in 2007. It was the first major national cyber attack. I'm sure you've all known it. So this is an example of, I'm offering here an example of what it means when NATO interests, or the big states in NATO, the big partners, are overwhelming the political and strategic interests of the small parties. And in that sense, I'm also showing you here, offering another question. Do NATO partners share the same appreciation of threats? I've been working, as I mentioned, I've been working in Canada, I've worked in Georgia, I've been working in some Scandinavian countries. I've been doing some work with the German armed forces. And every time I get into a discourse with them on my métier, on strategic operational design or systemic operational design and the education of generals, I'm always surprised at what these other countries perceive as threat. Because as an Israeli, coming from the military, when I'm saying that something is a threat to me it's an existential threat. It's an actual threat of the lives and the integrity of my country. But when I speak to other countries like Canada or the Scandinavian states, their existential threats is somewhere between climate change and, in the case of the Canadian Armed Forces, sexual harassment and misconduct in the senior echelons of their military. That's the threat. That's their number one priority when they're doing strategy. So if we're looking at NATO, and again, NATO members are not equal. But if we are engaging in a dialogue with NATO as partners, as in security cooperation, do we and them value the same threat? And what does it mean if we don't? Israel and Colombia have existential threats. So this is also something to take into consideration. The fact that we're using a term doesn't mean that we're thinking the same. And it's no coincidence why, over the last couple of years, the Western world prefers talking about global power competition because competition doesn't mention enemies or rivals or armed conflict. So here, again, is an example. Obviously, I don't know if you recognize it, but this is a couple of months ago, Belarus, another rogue country in Europe, had some years where it was also going west, like Georgia, but now taking a sharp turn to Putin again. Lukashenko and Putin are in good relations. And several months ago, I think Lukashenko, of all the leaders in Europe, is I think he's the crazy one. And when he decided to intercept a commercial jet, Ryanair airline, a British airline, over the skies of Belarus, in order to take down an opposition, to capture an opposition activist, the world and NATO and the European Union, they protested, they complained diplomatically, but they didn't do anything in order to stop it. The same, obviously, for opposition leaders in Russia, like Alexei Navalny and so on. So this used to be considered an act of war. An interception of a commercial civilian jet was supposed to be an act of war, but nothing happened. Another issue, can NATO be trusted? Partnerships, dialogues are about trust. First and foremost, about trust. So this is another example. This is 2014, Russia taking over Crimea from the Ukraine. Nothing happened. Russia is still considered the former USSR as its own territory. And yet again, diplomatic protests, complaints, no sanctions. No one dares to poke the bear, the Russian. My next question, and this is a big question for me. Does NATO, as an organization, have what we call a strategy? When we call a strategy, it's what we call a strategy is the identification of political interests, and in that case, maybe international political, yes, global interests, but in the context of a certain year. This is not something, strategy doesn't have a lifespan of 10 years or 20 years. Strategy, in the pace of change of reality that we live in, is maybe 2 to 3 years old, should be, and then should be reevaluated. So does NATO have a strategy? Does it understand its interests? Does it have a common interest, or it's just the interest of the big states? How is it willing to transform? And what does NATO put as priorities? This is photo of, not photo, capture, yes, of two, and by the way, it's a Western organization. They are very good at bureaucracy and papers. Or not? Okay. So they're very good at writing papers. It's very academic. So there is a NATO strategic concept paper from 2010. You can see it on the left. For the defense and security of the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the buzzwords are active engagement and modern defense. I think I just gave 3 examples where none of this happened. And on the right, 2 years ago, they started working on a new strategic concept. It's called NATO 2030. And the buzzword is United for a New Era. And they're talking about climate change and gender politics and social issues. And these are open, they're online, you can download them. Again, all very Western, transparent, and open for all. Many groups are doing work in the direction that NATO needs to take. Definitely when you read the 2010 paper, you see that they missed on most of their projections, if you're looking at it 220. And I think in 230, they're off-shooting because they didn't solve the problems that they thought they were facing in 2010. They just leap over them and they move on to a new era, but didn't solve the problems of the old one. So what they do have, because NATO, and I've also seen it from the IDF side and from the other militaries that I've been working with, and I'm sure you've known it, you also know it here, those who wear the uniform. NATO fills the agenda all year with activities, training, simulations, standardization, education of all its members and partners, war games, and so on. This is ongoing activity that consumes time, writing document, writing manuals, sharing those manuals, translating them to all the languages. So this is what I call being very proactive, but dry. When it comes to getting wet and actually applying force, I think they're very reactive. And if there is one word that keeps being repeated in these documents, is crisis management. Now, I've mentioned before, and I think I've mentioned it also this week, crisis management, from our perspective, is anti-strategy. Because you found yourself in a situation where you didn't plan to be, and you can only be totally reactive to it. So you have crisis management in these documents. You have, as I said, open dialogue, mentions of diplomatic solutions, and a lot of transparency. And also, when you read these documents, you see that the type of warfare that they will be willing to engage, and you can also see it from the type of training and simulations that they're doing, is very symmetric. It's very regular. It's very Western. And it's unlike anything that is actually happening in the world right now. Obviously, all the countries that are members of NATO have, and I'm putting aside special operations and intelligence, okay? I'm putting, and cyber operations. I'm putting them aside. Countries have these capabilities, and these capabilities transcend what I call regular or symmetric warfare. But the majority of the armed forces that are being part of the NATO coalition are still engaged in old type of warfare. So this is also something that I think we need to consider when with the assets that the Israeli Defense Forces and the Colombian Armed Forces have when they engaged with NATO. And also bearing in mind that the actual enemies of the actual threat, existential threat to NATO, which is Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran in an indirect way, they don't do symmetric warfare, and they don't do regular warfare, and this is also something to consider. Okay, here, and I just looked it up yesterday when I'm looking for some images. This is from the NATO website. There are all these interactive maps where you can see where NATO missions are, where NATO facilities are, and where they're doing training. And obviously, you can see from these two maps, you can see Colombia on the left side. You cannot see Israel; it's too small, but it's somewhere there. It's very, very European oriented. Even the U.S. is not part of the deployment of NATO assets. It's all about Europe. It's all about Russia. Operations and missions on the left side, projecting stability and fighting terrorism on the other side. Terrorism mainly from the Middle East, which is closer to my region. But this is the focus of NATO. So I've used the term global, yes, global, local. When I'm thinking of NATO's expansionism in the last decade, they're open to the door is open to everyone. The door is open to players like Colombia, and the door is open to players like Israel and smaller countries with less significance. And I question, what do they want from us? Do they just want our capabilities? They keep saying in their documents that their focus is on the North Atlantic environment. What do they want? And are we going to enjoy the same type of security umbrella? And are we going to enjoy this political support and diplomatic support that the other members have? Because we are not in their focus. This is something that I think we need to consider, because obviously going into this kind of dialogue means that we also pay prices. And the last one, which is maybe too abstract right now, but in the last couple of years, there have been discussions whether, especially when President Trump, the former US president, was talking about the US leaving NATO and stopping its military presence in NATO. And the strong European countries started talking about whether or not Europe should have its military, a unified military, or NATO becoming a unified military rather than a military alliance, a conglomeration of militaries. I think from the point of view of small states, it will be very problematic if they want to go into the direction of a unified NATO military, because that would be, again, giving our assets, like Georgia did in 2008, into missions that are not in our national focus. So I'm diving in for a moment to NATO and Colombia, and this is based on a workshop that we did here 3 years ago under the direction of Colonel Rojas, when Doctrine Damasco was formally launched in November 2018. And part of the workshop, or the focus of the workshop, was Colombian entrance into NATO. And some of the issues they identified, the participants identified, there were majors and lieutenant colonels and some colonels, was first of all that Colombia, like Israel, is an island of success in the region of failed states. So obviously, yes, NATO wants this partnership with Colombia. Marcus talked about it as well in great length. A pillar of stability that you can do business with in the region where you are not a part of, and you're not, you don't have the intelligence on, and you don't know how to operate in. The second point is that that Colombia proved a solid commitment to westernize its armed forces, part of it through the process of writing a doctrine. The third point was that they identified in this workshop was that by writing doctrine and by becoming westernized and by regularizing your forces and changing the focus to a more symmetric kind of, and regular kind of warfare, that there are tensions there because you're losing some of your intellectual independence when you try to gain legitimacy. And they started discussing some other offerings that the Colombian armed forces may have to the world. And we keep saying that, yes, we think that Colombia, I'm speaking as Israel, think that Colombia has, her value is much bigger than what is perceived. And the final point was what we call the Colombian tiger and the taming of the tiger, that it does come with a heavy price, and be aware not to lose your cultural and professional identity in this engagement. Looking from an Israeli perspective, what are the how is Israel perceived from the side of NATO? So the first one, yes, we are also a westernized, stable country, westernized proxy in an Arab-Muslim volatile geopolitics. The other members of the Mediterranean dialogue are Egypt, Tunisia, and other countries. Egypt obviously is a very strong partner, but others are not so strong, and they're still part of this dialogue. Obviously, Israel has a lot to offer. But after being a proxy, basically what we offer NATO is technology, intelligence, cyber, AI, and many other things. And we are also trying to mitigate this tension between legitimacy or illegitimacy and maintaining our strategic operational degrees of freedom. As much as we want to get closer to NATO, in order to gain, part of it is in order to gain more international legitimacy from the point of view of the world, which doesn't see eye to eye with us, especially when it comes to our dialogue with the Palestinians. We still need to maintain our independent strategic operational degrees of freedom to operate against Iran, to operate against Hezbollah, to operate against Hamas in Gaza. And every time we do so, we suffer from our legitimacy inferiority. Okay, so I haven't seen the film yet. I don't know if you've seen it, but I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to close my my talk with some ideas about Israel and Colombia being the special agents of NATO, like 007. And what should be these type of offerings when we, instead of trying, it's a bit of changing the direction of dialogue and partnership between NATO and these incumbent partners to the dialogue. It's instead of them doing due diligence to us, we should do due diligence to them. And some examples. First of all, these two countries, Israel and Colombia, shared a natural capacity towards strategy and systemic operational design. And this is because I've spoken about it at great length on Monday, and all these videos are online. But in a nutshell, it's because we have been operating for many, many decades in a very complex environment, both internal and external, civilian and military, and engaging in a type of warfare that demands constant adaptability and transformation, which other militaries not necessarily have. The second point is, and it derived from the first one, is our professional capacity for fighting in gray zone, another buzzword that is very popular these days, Gray zones means asymmetric warfares, prolonged conflicts, wars with no end, and asymmetric warfare or hybrid warfare. But what we have in this capacity to offer is obviously our special operations capacity, intelligence capacities, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and so on and so on. And we have much more experience. And obviously Colombia has more than us, but also the capacity to negotiate with different type of players and entities. And these are capabilities that NATO partners and other NATO members, and even the big ones, not necessarily share in the same way. The third point is organizational capacity for what I call independent pursuit of operational end states, or what, if I mentioned Canada before, or small states going second. So it means that another country is deciding what the interests are, what the end state is, what the outcome should be, devising the strategy, and then you go second. I think Israel definitely, and also Colombia, know how to go in first and pursue their own interest. And if they need to do it independently, they would do it independently. And the fourth point is our political capacity for managing, as I mentioned, the tensions between internal and external threats and civilian and military conflicts. Since all wars that we see in the last 2 decades are wars that involve civilian and military environments, this is another asset that should be valued and measured, that is currently not being measured when we are measured, Israel and Colombia, in our capacity to support NATO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for your interesting talk. It's so interesting that Rigoberta Menchur, Nobel Peace winner, coincide with the critics you're just doing to this North Atlantic Treaty. Your quote, "Without legitimacy, the military power is weak." That caught my attention. When you see the border with Venezuela and how you can feel that with a big military supported by Russia versus an illegitimate government.
You will have to answer that because you are the experts, and maybe you will have something to teach us as Israel when we have these problems of illegitimacy in our interactions with the Palestinians. I think you have more experience than us than we do.
Another question. Colombia, the United States, Guatemala, Honduras are moving their embassy headquarters to Jerusalem. What political implications could this have for the relations in the triad that we're looking at, but in general, the geopolitics in general?
So you are taking me away from NATO, but I will play. First of all, the type of decisions, I would give them 10 to 20 years before I say, okay, this was a move that cannot be. Take the example of the U.S. Embassy. President Trump did several major moves of what I call doing a reset in the Middle East in a time span of 2 years. First of all, he neutralized Qasem Soleimani, which is the ultimate commander of Quds Force, the proxy of Iran, which was devastating the entire region from Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and obviously Israel. At the same time, he was signing with promoting with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, what we call the Abraham Agreements, which after many, many years, when we were told that We cannot move forward legitimacy-wise with the world. We have to promote a Palestinian state. They bypassed it and signed agreements with major Arab countries, and more countries are going to follow. And the third move that he did was to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. But he was replaced. He didn't win the elections in 2020. And in the Biden's administration, there are ongoing, there are radical, progressive parts in the Democratic Party calling to move back the embassy to Tel Aviv and calling for an opening of a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem. So let's wait and see if this move of embajadas to Jerusalem is a permanent one, or is it something that's going to change according to global politics. As an Israeli, obviously, I'm very proud. As an Israeli, obviously, I think it's the right move. And my last point on it, because we were mentioning Jerusalem, my esposo is an entrepreneur in social and public affairs. He's been doing a lot of work in Jerusalem, in the municipality as well. And he has a saying that Jerusalem is holding all the tension, all the global tensions in one city. The religious tensions, the political tensions, social tensions, economic tensions. And if the tensions in Jerusalem are being resolved, then there will be global peace. So in that sense, I don't know if the moving of the embajadas are promoting that peace or not, but as an Israeli, obviously, I'm very happy.
I have a question that reaches a conclusion that I am not in agreement with, but within an academic framework, I dare pose. Since NATO seeks to control terrorist attacks in the Middle East, how are Israeli attacks against Palestine allowed? How is it possible for it to be allowed? I am making this in an academic setting, I know.
Is the question coming from someone here, or we need to talk to someone online? Because I want to know what Palestinian what attacks on the Palestinians are they referring to before I pull my my sniper rifle. Okay. I'll answer in an academic setting.
The question is from Ana Maria Guerra.
Sí. Tienes microphone. What Palestinian attack? What attacks on the Palestinians are you referring to? Creo que necesitas una.
I would say that I don't want to intervene, but I would say it's not attack, it's a defense. Well, at the beginning of this year, the Israeli government attacked several different parts of Palestine, and these attacks had repercussions and on Palestine, considering that Palestine has no army, and could be said that there is an armed group that wants to defend this Palestinian territory. But on all the attacks from Israel to Palestine, civil society is involved, and usually not that armed group. And in that, and my question in that sense is how does NATO?
Jose Munoz, can you put video number 3? I think we need to see it again. Yes, it will be a good answer.
El de las lucecitas.
And then I will continue my answer. Okay, I will start, and if the video begins, then I will hold my answer until it finishes. I don't know what attacks you were referring to, but the violent conflict with the Palestinians, it is first of all very different from there is the region where the Palestinian Authority is governing, which is Judea and Samaria, and there is Gaza, where Hamas is in power independently since 2005. With the Palestinian Authority, we have security cooperation, intelligence and operational cooperation. We're working together to stop terrorist attacks. In regard to the Hamas, this is an ongoing conflict. Sometimes they fire and sometimes we fire, and it depends who is writing the narrative to say what is started, which were the first ones to start. And I will go back to NATO after this. Número 3, por favor. El último. Le video leen, por favor. El último. Nuestro uno. This is Palestinian rockets being shot from Gaza on Israel. So I think NATO and the EU and the US have seen Operation Guardian of the Walls, and after they send all their security personnel to see the after-action reports and see the operational value of what the IDF had to offer, which is one side of the story, they recognize this is a problem, that Israel is behaving in a very westernized manner now. The fact that the Human Rights Council, which is led by non-democratic entities, is trying to pursue declarations against Israel and sending them to international court at The Hague. You see all the Western countries, the big players, vetoing these declarations. But I think Marcus wants to say something in that respect as well.
Can you hear me, Colonel? Can you hear me?
See.
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Peckel. Gracias, Ofra. Yes, I would think it's clear that Gaza is an entity where there are 2 million Palestinians being held hostage of a terrorist organization that took power by force in 2007, driving away the legitimate Palestinian government of Palestine, which is the Palestinian Authority. It's not that they got there through elections. They took power by force. And they have 2 million Palestinians held hostage and using them as human shields. When from Gaza, Israel is attacked with rockets to kill civilians in Israel. These rockets are not located in military bases. They're not targeted at military bases. They go to places where civilian population, whether there's mosques or hospitals. So based on international law, we have the right to react, or Israel has a right to react to these attacks, where unfortunately civilians die. But it is Hamas's responsibility for these civilians' death, because they are the ones who put these civilians there, and they go to civilians' houses and attack Israel citizens. And so we're talking about a different entity than the Palestinian entity that governs Cisjordan, and where there is actual cooperation with Israel, and they persecute the same terrorists that Israel persecutes and Hamas. So we need to be clear about what is going on in Gaza, what is it that Israel is doing in respect of international law. Before launching every rocket, Israel verifies and warns civilians to the extent possible. But of course, in this type of asymmetrical wars, when the terrorists mimic with the civilian or conceal in the civilian population, these are the things that end up happening. Thank you, Dr. Peckel.
But after I attacked you because you mentioned Israeli attacks, I will give you a straight answer. I think with NATO, sobre la mesa, there is a disclaimer in the NATO website that the conflict with the Palestinians is not resolved, and the world doesn't recognize Israel's views on the conflict. But debajo la mesa, they want the operational knowledge that comes from these testing grounds. So this is a realpolitik answer. I mean, sobre la mesa, they would say one thing, and debajo la mesa, they want it. They want this experience, military experience.
Last question. You said that you have talked about military cooperation between Colombia and Israel, but what about cooperation in terms of research, technology, and education?
Marcus is the expert on that.
Thank you, Ofra.
Muchas gracias, Ofra. Well, Colonel, it's a lot of things. General Ambassador in Colombia recently opened plants that synthesize water from air in La Guajira and other departments. These are not just inventions for show. These are actually inventions that help people live better. We're talking about technology cooperation in terms of agriculture also. It's very important in the agricultural development of Colombia. We're talking about the number of students. There's an association of fellows that includes thousands of members who are people who have benefited from going to Israel and studying in the different fields of the country. There's also a film exchange there, and Israel film festival in Colombia, and there's literary exchanges, the book fair. There's always been a presence of both. So it's quite an intense exchange between Israel and Colombia, and beyond the trade agreements or beyond the military cooperation. I think we can talk about what this relationship includes beyond the military aspects. Quite an important appreciation. Dr. Peckel, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Dr. Ofra.